There is a version of the Vietnam War that most Americans learned. It involves jungles and helicopters, protest marches and draft cards, a president who lied and a generation that resisted. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The problem with the Vietnam War was never primarily that it was misunderstood. The problem was that it was misrepresented systematically from the top of the chain of command down to the press briefings held every afternoon in Saigon. Briefings that journalists started calling the 5 o'clock follies, not because they were obviously false, but because they were so consistently optimistic that everyone in the room understood something was being withheld, and no one could say precisely what. The war did not begin with a lie exactly. It began with an ambiguity, which is worse, because ambiguity is harder to trace and easier to sustain. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August of 1964 involved two separate events on two separate nights. The first, on August 2nd, was real. North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox in disputed waters. The second, on August 4th, almost certainly did not happen. The radar contacts that sailors reported were likely the result of weather interference and frayed nerves on a dark night in the South China Sea. The ship's commander, Captain John Herrick, sent a cable within hours suggesting the second attack had not occurred, recommending a complete evaluation before any further action. That cable was received. It was read. It was set aside. Lyndon Johnson went on national television and told the American public that unprovoked attacks had occurred on the high seas, and Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the president essentially unlimited authority to wage war in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration. The resolution passed 416-0 in the House. It passed 88-2 in the Senate. The two senators who voted against it were Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska. Both were defeated in subsequent elections. The country was not interested in doubt. What followed over the next 11 years was not a clean escalation toward a defined objective. It was something more like a drift, a slow accumulation of decisions that each seemed manageable in isolation and catastrophic in aggregate. By 1965, there were nearly 200,000 American troops in Vietnam. By 1968, there were more than 500,000. The stated mission shifted so many times that it became difficult to say what victory would look like, and this was not an accident of poor planning. It was the result of a fundamental contradiction at the heart of American strategy. The United States was trying to create a stable, independent South Vietnamese government capable of defending itself, while simultaneously fighting the war in a way that made South Vietnamese self-sufficiency nearly impossible to develop. American firepower, American logistics, American decision-making dominated every significant military operation. The South Vietnamese military, the ARVN, was trained and equipped and consistently sidelined. The implicit message was that they could not be trusted to fight their own war, and so they were never fully required to. And so they never fully did, and this outcome was then cited as evidence that the South Vietnamese lacked the will to defend themselves. The metrics came early. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, believed deeply in quantitative analysis. He had applied it successfully at Ford Motor Company, and he brought it to the Pentagon with evangelical conviction. The problem was that the Vietnam War did not produce the kind of data that could be measured cleanly. Territory changed hands and changed back. Political loyalty in rural villages was invisible and unstable. The progress of a counterinsurgency cannot be graphed the way production output can be graphed. But McNamara needed numbers, and so numbers were produced. The most important number, the one that would come to define and distort the entire American effort, was the body count. The body count was the primary metric of success in Vietnam because it was the metric that could be reliably generated. If you killed people, you could count the bodies, and the count would demonstrate progress. The logic was coherent in a narrow sense. In a war without front lines, without territorial objectives, without any fixed measure of advance or retreat, the enemy's dead were evidence that something was being accomplished. The problem was that the body count was unreliable from the moment it began to be collected. Units under pressure to show results inflated their counts. Officers who reported high counts received praise and promotion. Officers who reported low counts faced scrutiny. The incentive structure was transparent, and it corrupted the data completely. Dead civilians were counted as enemy combatants. Dead soldiers from Allied units were occasionally counted as enemy dead. Animals were counted. Anything that could be added to the tally was added. Studies conducted after the war estimated that official body counts may have exceeded actual enemy deaths by a factor of 2 or 3. The numbers went up the chain of command, were compiled into weekly reports, were briefed to the president, were cited in press conferences, and the entire apparatus functioned as if the numbers were real because everyone needed them to be real. General William Westmoreland, who commanded American forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, believed in attrition. His strategy, such as it was, rested on the premise that if American forces killed enough North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers faster than they could be replaced, the enemy would eventually lack the manpower to continue fighting. He called the point at which enemy losses exceeded replacements the crossover point. He believed it was being approached throughout 1967. He returned to the United States that November to reassure Congress and the public. He said the end was beginning to come into view. He said the enemy's hopes were bankrupt. 7 weeks later, on the morning of January 31st, 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year holiday known as Tet, coordinated attacks struck more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns simultaneously. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces attacked the American embassy in Saigon. They attacked the city of Hue and held it for 26 days. They attacked Khe Sanh and Da Nang and Bien Hoa. The offensive was a military failure in the narrow sense. Most of the attacking forces were destroyed. The expected civilian uprising in support of the North did not materialize. But the Tet Offensive was a catastrophic political event for the American war effort because it demonstrated to anyone paying attention that the official version of the war's progress bore no relationship to the reality on the ground. A country that had been told the enemy was broken watched enemy soldiers fighting inside the American embassy compound on live television, and the credibility gap, which had been growing for years in quiet ways, became an abyss. The soldiers who fought in Vietnam existed inside a reality that the official war only partially described. Many of them arrived young, in their late teens or early 20s, with an understanding of war shaped by the Second World War, by John Wayne movies, by the idea that American military power represented a kind of righteous clarity. What they found was different. The enemy was often invisible. The terrain was dense and disorienting and hostile in ways that had nothing to do with enemy action. The heat was constant. The humidity was constant. The insects were constant. The leeches were constant. The fear was constant in a specific way, not the fear of open battle, which had its own terrible clarity, but the fear of everything. The fear of the path you were walking on, of the tree line, of the village that seemed quiet, of the child standing at the roadside. Vietnam was a war in which the landscape itself could kill you. Landmines and booby traps were everywhere. Punji stake pits were everywhere. The enemy had spent years learning to use the terrain in ways that made every step a potential last step. Soldiers stopped trusting the ground they walked on, which is a very specific kind of psychological damage, different from the fear of bullets or artillery, more corrosive because it cannot be bracketed or shut off. The soldiers who served in Vietnam were also, in a structural sense, very young. The average age of a combat soldier in Vietnam was 19. In World War II, it had been 26. The difference matters. A 19-year-old has not yet developed the psychological infrastructure that allows adults to process extreme stress and moral complexity without permanent damage. He has not yet built the interior architecture that allows him to compartmentalize what he sees and go on functioning. And what the 19-year-olds in Vietnam were asked to see was extreme. The rules of engagement were confusing and inconsistent. Free fire zones, officially designated areas where anything that moved could be shot. existed throughout the country and created situations in which civilians were killed without anyone necessarily intending to kill them. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant was routinely unclear and routinely collapsed. Soldiers were asked to make split-second decisions about who was dangerous and who was not in conditions where the wrong decision could mean their own death. And there was no clean answer, and there was no training that adequately prepared them for the ambiguity, and the ambiguity accumulated. The military used a one-year tour of duty rotation system in Vietnam, which was administratively practical and psychologically destructive. Unlike in previous wars, where units trained together and deployed together and built collective identity and shared experience, in Vietnam, individual soldiers rotated in and out on 12-month cycles. A unit might have soldiers who had been in country for 11 months alongside soldiers who had been there for 11 days. And the veterans and the newcomers had almost nothing in common except proximity. The soldier approaching his rotation date thought about nothing except getting home alive, which meant he became risk-averse and unreliable in ways that increased danger for everyone around him. The new soldier, called the FNG, which stood for a phrase that will not be repeated here, was simultaneously overeager and undertrained, and likely to make the kind of mistakes that got people killed. The system ensured that institutional knowledge was constantly being destroyed and rebuilt, that units never developed the sustained cohesion that allows soldiers to function well under extreme stress, and that the most experienced soldiers left precisely when they would have been most valuable. Drug use in Vietnam was pervasive in ways that were not reflected in official reports for years. Heroin was cheap and easily available throughout South Vietnam, in part because the South Vietnamese government and certain elements of the CIA were deeply entangled with the opium trade in the Golden Triangle. Alfred McCoy's research, published in 1972 in a book that the CIA attempted to suppress before publication, documented in detail how Air America, the CIA proprietary airline, transported opium from Laos into South Vietnam. The military knew about the drug problem. Surveys conducted in 1971 suggested that somewhere between 25 and 35% of American soldiers had tried heroin. The military's response was initially denial, and then a detection and punishment approach that drove drug use underground, rather than treating the underlying conditions that made an anesthetic for psychological pain so attractive. The soldiers were not weak. The conditions were intolerable, and they found the available relief. Fragging, the killing of American officers by their own enlisted men, was another reality of the Vietnam War that received minimal coverage and generated no public accounting. The term came from the fragmentation grenades that were often used, though other methods were employed. The practice began in the late 1960s and escalated through 1971. The Army acknowledged several hundred incidents between 1969 and 1972. The actual number was likely higher, since many deaths in combat zones could not be definitively attributed to enemy or friendly fire. Fragging happened for reasons that were not random. It was most common when soldiers perceived their officers as reckless, incompetent, or indifferent to their survival. It happened when orders seemed to prioritize statistics over lives, when patrols were sent into known kill zones without adequate justification, when officers seemed more concerned with their career advancement than with the welfare of the men under their command. The soldiers who committed fraggings were not in most cases psychopaths. They were men in an impossible situation who had run out of other options, who had concluded that the formal chain of command would not protect them, and that protecting themselves required removing the source of danger. This is a profound institutional failure dressed in the most extreme possible clothing, and the military's response was to process the incidents individually as criminal matters, rather than to examine the systemic conditions that produced them. The Phoenix program was perhaps the most consequential covert operation of the Vietnam War, and it was hidden from the American public for years. Established in 1967 and formalized in 1968, Phoenix was a program designed to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, the political and administrative network that sustained the insurgency in South Vietnamese villages. Neutralization was a word that could mean arrest, defection, or death. In practice, it very often meant death, frequently through means that had no legal foundation. Provincial reconnaissance units, South Vietnamese paramilitary teams trained and funded by the CIA, carried out most of the killings. The program claimed to have neutralized over 80,000 people between 1968 and 1972. More than 20,000 of those were killed. The program's defenders argued that it was effective at disrupting the Viet Cong organizational structure. The program's critics argued that its targeting was unreliable, that personal vendettas, financial corruption, and imprecise intelligence led to the killing of large numbers of people who had nothing to do with the Viet Cong. William Colby, who ran the program and later became CIA director, acknowledged in congressional testimony that mistakes were made, but maintained the program's fundamental legitimacy. The testimonies of provincial officials who participated suggest that mistakes were not aberrations, but structural features of a system that valued quantity of neutralizations over quality of intelligence. The relationship between American forces and the Vietnamese civilian population was complicated in ways that were rarely described honestly. The Strategic Hamlet Program, which attempted to separate rural South Vietnamese from the Viet Cong by forcibly relocating entire villages into fortified compounds, generated enormous hostility. Families were removed from land they had farmed for generations. Ancestral graves were left behind. The new hamlets were crowded and undersupplied and frequently poorly defended. Many of them fell to Viet Cong attacks within months of being established. The people who had been moved did not become more committed to the South Vietnamese government. They became more resentful, and some of them became collaborators with the very forces the program was designed to isolate them from. The lesson, repeated so many times throughout the war that it became almost a kind of dark comedy, was that military and political objectives were not only distinct but frequently contradictory, and that pursuing one tended to undermine the other, and that no one in the chain of command was accountable for the contradiction. Agent Orange was deployed as if it were a neutral military tool, a defoliant that cleared jungle cover and denied the enemy concealment. Between 1961 and 1971, American aircraft sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnam, roughly 12 million of which contained a compound now known to cause cancer, severe birth defects, chloroquine, and a range of neurological conditions. The soldiers who handled the chemical were not told it was dangerous. The farmers whose fields were sprayed were not warned. The women who later gave birth to children with severe deformities were not told why. The companies that manufactured the chemicals knew there were problems. Internal documents that emerged in litigation decades later showed that Dow Chemical and Monsanto were aware of dioxin contamination in their products as early as the 1960s. The military continued spraying. The effects on the Vietnamese population were not studied by the American government. A 2003 study estimated that 3 million Vietnamese people suffered health effects from Agent Orange exposure, including 150,000 children born with severe birth defects. The American government did not acknowledge veterans' claims related to Agent Orange until 1991, more than 2 decades after spraying ended. The air war over North Vietnam was presented to the American public as a surgical campaign designed to destroy military targets while minimizing civilian casualties. The actual pattern of bombing was considerably broader. Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign that ran from 1965 to 1968, dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than the United States dropped on all of Europe during World War II. The targeting included industrial facilities and transportation networks, but also frequently included areas where civilian casualties were inevitable. The North Vietnamese government estimated that roughly 50,000 civilians were killed in the bombing campaign. American officials disputed the figure, but independent observers who traveled to North Vietnam during this period reported widespread destruction in civilian areas. The bombing did not break North Vietnamese morale, as its architects had hoped. It generated instead a level of popular resistance and social cohesion that was documented by American intelligence and ignored by American planners. The lesson of bombing campaigns, available from the historical record of World War II, was that they tend to strengthen rather than weaken civilian resolve. That lesson was not applied. The media and the war existed in a relationship that was more complicated than the narrative of a free press exposing military lies suggests. For most of the war, the major networks and major newspapers were broadly supportive or at least non-oppositional. Access to Vietnam was relatively open, which created the perception of a free press while actually generating enormous amounts of military-approved content. The military gave journalists rides on helicopters and access to briefings and meals in mess halls, and this hospitality created relationships and obligations that shaped coverage in subtle but consistent ways. The turning point was not the liberal media realizing the war was wrong. The turning point was Tet, which made the official version of the war so obviously indefensible that even supportive coverage could no longer sustain it. Walter Cronkite's famous editorial in February of 1968, in which he said the war appeared to be a stalemate, is often cited as a pivotal moment. What is less often noted is that Cronkite had been largely supportive of the war effort for years before that broadcast, and that his shift reflected a broader institutional recognition that the official narrative had become untenable, not a sudden awakening of journalistic conscience. The anti-war movement in the United States was real, and it mattered, but its relationship to the soldiers fighting the war was more fraught than popular memory suggests. Returning veterans were sometimes treated badly. The image of soldiers being spat on at airports is contested by historians, who have found little contemporaneous documentation of widespread incidents. But the general social atmosphere was alienating in ways that were real and well documented. Veterans came home to a country that did not know how to talk to them, that was ashamed of the war in a way that attached itself to the people who had fought it rather than to the policies that had created it. The VA system was underfunded and unprepared for the psychological damage that Vietnam veterans carried. PTSD, not yet named as such, was treated as personal weakness or moral failure. Veterans' claims for disability benefits were routinely denied. Many of the men who came home simply stopped talking about what they had seen, not because they had processed it, but because the country made clear it did not want to hear. The strategic Hamlets were not the only program that failed quietly and without accountability. Pacification, the broad effort to win Vietnamese civilian loyalty through development and governance, was a parallel track to the military effort that consumed enormous resources and produced minimal results. The problem was not primarily one of implementation, though implementation was poor. The problem was that the South Vietnamese government lacked legitimacy in large parts of the country, and no amount of American money or organizational effort could manufacture legitimacy for a government that much of the population viewed as corrupt and unrepresentative. The Saigon government went through a series of coups and leadership changes throughout the 1960s. The United States supported Ngo Dinh Diem until the CIA facilitated the coup that killed him in 1963. A succession of military governments followed, each one installed or tolerated by the United States because the alternative was a communist government, and the logic of containment did not allow for any other consideration. The South Vietnamese people watching this sequence of events drew conclusions about American commitment to democracy that were not flattering. The Cambodian incursion of 1970 represented one of the more significant expansions of the war, announced by Nixon in April as a limited operation to destroy North Vietnamese sanctuaries across the border. Nixon had promised to end the war. He had run on a promise to end the war. He had implied he had a secret plan to end the war. The invasion of Cambodia was, in structural terms, an expansion of the war, and it was recognized as such immediately. Protests spread to American college campuses. At Kent State University in Ohio, on May 4, 1970, National Guard soldiers fired into a crowd of student protesters, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. The students who were killed were not violent. They were not close to the National Guard line. Allison Krauss was 20 years old, Jeffrey Miller was 20, Sandra Scheuer was 20, William Schroeder was 19. The Guard soldiers were not prosecuted. The Nixon White House's initial response was to suggest that the protesters shared responsibility for their own deaths. The country moved on. The Cambodian invasion did not achieve its stated objectives. The North Vietnamese sanctuaries that were struck had largely been evacuated before the operation began. Intelligence intercepts that were later declassified suggested the North Vietnamese knew the attack was coming well in advance. The operation accelerated the destabilization of Cambodia, contributing to conditions that would ultimately bring the Khmer Rouge to power in 1975, with consequences that would dwarf anything the operation was designed to prevent. The connection between American policy in Cambodia and the subsequent genocide has never been formally acknowledged by the United States government. The CORDS program, Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, was the primary vehicle for American pacification efforts after 1967. It was run by Robert Comer, who received the nickname Blowtorch Bob for his aggressive management style and his willingness to cut through bureaucratic obstruction. CORDS generated enormous amounts of data. Hamlet Evaluation System reports assessed the security and developmental status of every village in South Vietnam on a monthly basis. The reports were color-coded. Green meant secure, red meant contested, black meant enemy-controlled. The reports were largely meaningless because the South Vietnamese officials who provided the underlying data had every incentive to report improvement and no incentive to report accurately. Corruption in the reporting system was endemic and well known at the senior levels of CORDS and was routinely dismissed as a solvable implementation problem rather than a fundamental indictment of the approach. The soldiers who did the fighting understood things about the war that the planners did not want to hear. They understood that search and destroy operations, which were the primary tactic of Westmoreland's war, were tactically effective in the narrow sense that they found and killed the enemy, but strategically pointless because the enemy simply withdrew, allowed themselves to absorb the casualties, waited for the Americans to leave and returned. The Americans could not hold the territory they cleared. There were not enough of them. And even if there had been enough of them, holding territory in a counterinsurgency that lacked popular legitimacy is an inherently temporary condition. The soldiers doing the clearing knew this. They cleared the same villages multiple times in some cases, returned to find the Viet Cong had reconstituted their local networks within weeks of an operation's conclusion. The operational logic required them to treat this as motivation to clear the village again, rather than evidence that clearing the village was not producing lasting results. The question of what the soldiers were fighting for became genuinely difficult to answer as the war progressed. The early volunteers and the early draftees had reasons available to them that were legible within the Cold War framework. The domino theory, the containment of communism, the defense of a free people's right to self-determination. These were not absurd reasons even if they were not ultimately sufficient. But by 1969 and 1970, the soldiers arriving in Vietnam were fighting in a war that had already begun to wind down in the American political imagination, in a war whose purpose was no longer clearly articulated by anyone in authority, in a war whose primary strategic objective seemed to have become the negotiated extraction of American forces without the visible appearance of defeat. They were being asked to die for a settlement that everyone knew was coming, in a conflict whose conclusion had been effectively predetermined by Tet and by the collapse of American domestic support. The soldiers knew this in the way that soldiers always know the truth of their situation, which is directly and without the filters that protect people far from the fighting. They knew it, and they had to keep going anyway. And what that does to a person is not a thing that can be graphed or briefed or added to a weekly report. Vietnamization, Nixon's policy of gradually transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while withdrawing American troops, was presented as a path to peace with honor. It was also a recognition that the war was lost in the political sense and that the remaining question was how to manage the loss. The policy transferred responsibility without transferring capability. The ARVN was given more equipment and more responsibility and less American support, and the results were predictable to anyone who had watched the preceding decade of the war. The Easter Offensive of 1972, in which North Vietnamese conventional forces crossed into South Vietnam in large numbers, demonstrated that ARVN units could fight when adequately supported by American air power, but could not sustain themselves without it. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were signed with the knowledge that they would not hold. Henry Kissinger received the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating them. The North Vietnamese negotiator, Le Duc Tho, refused the prize. The fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, was watched on television by Americans who had already, in large numbers, moved on. The images of helicopters lifting off from the embassy roof, of Vietnamese people clinging to the landing skids, of the embassy swimming pool being used as a staging area for an evacuation that had been planned for years and executed badly regardless. Those images were powerful, and they were also the conclusion of a story that most Americans had stopped following closely. The war had been ending in the American consciousness since 1968. The physical ending in 1975 was almost administrative. 58,220 Americans were killed. An estimated 1 million to 3 million Vietnamese died in the conflict, though estimates vary widely, and the exact figure will never be known. The country of South Vietnam, which the United States had spent 20 years and enormous treasure attempting to preserve, ceased to exist. What happened to the soldiers who came home took decades to become visible. The Veterans Administration was not equipped to handle the psychological damage the war produced. Clinicians in the early 1970s were only beginning to develop the conceptual tools to describe what was happening to veterans who could not sleep, who startled at car backfires, who could not sustain relationships, who drank too much, who sometimes did not come back from wherever they went in their heads. The diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder was not formalized until 1980, in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It was formalized in large part because of advocacy by Vietnam veterans and the clinicians who treated them. Before 1980, the symptoms were described as combat fatigue or as individual psychological weakness. Veterans who sought treatment were often told that their problems were not service-related. Claims were denied. Men who had been exposed to Agent Orange developed cancers that the VA would not connect to their service for decades. The gap between what the war did to the people who fought it and what the institutions responsible for them acknowledged took a generation to close, and it never fully closed. The MIA issue, the question of American soldiers listed as missing in action in Southeast Asia, became a political and cultural phenomenon that outlasted the war by decades. Families of missing soldiers, and eventually a broader constituency of advocates and activists, maintained that live American prisoners were being held in Vietnam long after the war ended. The evidence for this was consistently thin and was repeatedly examined by government commissions that found no credible evidence of American prisoners still being held. The belief persisted anyway, sustained by grief and by a cultural need for the war to have an unresolved element, a remaining account that could theoretically be settled. In 1993, a Senate Select Committee on POW-MIA Affairs, chaired by John Kerry and co-chaired by Bob Smith, conducted an exhaustive investigation and concluded that there was no compelling evidence that any American POWs remained alive in Southeast Asia. The committee's findings did not end the controversy. They rarely do. The generals and the officials who managed the war from Washington and Saigon mostly went on to comfortable retirements. Robert McNamara left the Defense Department in 1968, went on to become president of the World Bank, and did not publicly acknowledge his doubts about the war until 1995, when he published a memoir in which he said the war had been a mistake. He said that he and others had been terribly wrong. He was 80 years old when he said it. William Westmoreland fought for decades against the characterization that his strategy had failed, sued CBS News for a documentary that accused him of knowing about inflated body counts, eventually settled the lawsuit without receiving any damages or retraction. He died in 2005. McGeorge Bundy, who as National Security Advisor helped craft the policies that committed the United States to full-scale war, spent his later years as a Foundation executive and academic. he acknowledged privately to historians that he had made serious errors, but was careful about what he put in writing. The accountability that was owed to the dead and to the damaged was never formally extracted. The villages of Vietnam, the small ones not on any map that mattered to the planners, experienced the war in ways that were not recorded in any official account. Families disrupted by forced relocations and then relocated again when the strategic hamlet program failed. Rice crops destroyed by herbicides. Water buffaloes killed in airstrikes. Young men conscripted by one side or the other, or sometimes by both sides in sequence, serving the South Vietnamese military, and then, when their hamlet fell under different control, serving the local Viet Cong infrastructure. The ordinary civilian experience of the Vietnam War was one of navigating between competing demands with no good options, of trying to keep children alive and property intact in a landscape that had become a battlefield without anyone asking the people living in it what they wanted. The surveys that American officials conducted on South Vietnamese civilian attitudes consistently found more ambivalence than support and more fear than commitment. The war's architects read these surveys and adjusted their public statements and left their strategy intact. The question of moral injury, the specific kind of psychological damage that comes not from witnessing violence, but from participating in actions that violate one's own moral framework, was not part of the official discourse during or immediately after the Vietnam War. It became part of the clinical literature later, as therapists working with veterans identified a pattern of damage that was distinct from the hyperarousal and avoidance that characterized post-traumatic stress. Moral injury is what happens when you know that something you did was wrong, and you cannot find a way to reconcile that knowledge with your understanding of yourself as a person. The soldiers who participated in the killing of civilians at My Lai in March of 1968, an event that was covered up for more than a year before journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story, lived with that knowledge in ways that are documented in oral histories and in subsequent behavior. Lieutenant William Calley, the only soldier convicted in the My Lai massacre, was found guilty of murdering at least 22 civilians. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. President Nixon intervened, ordered him released to house arrest pending appeal. He served 3 years under house arrest before his conviction was overturned. The soldiers who refused to participate, who refused to fire, who in some cases physically interposed themselves between attacking soldiers and Vietnamese civilians, were not decorated for their actions. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, who landed his helicopter between Calley's men and a group of Vietnamese civilians and ordered his crew to open fire on American soldiers if they continued shooting, was not recognized for his actions until 1998, 30 years after the event. The Central Intelligence Agency's role in Vietnam was extensive and consistently underreported. Beyond the Phoenix program and the involvement in the opium trade, the CIA ran a massive operation in Laos that was kept entirely secret from the American public for years. The secret war in Laos involved the training and support of Hmong tribesmen under General Vang Pao, the use of Air America for logistics, the running of a shadow army that at its height numbered in the tens of thousands. The Hmong fought effectively and suffered catastrophic casualties. When the war ended, and the communist Pathet Lao took power in Laos, the Hmong who had fought for the Americans were abandoned. Many were killed. Many fled to refugee camps in Thailand. A substantial diaspora eventually reached the United States, where the surviving Hmong veterans and their families settled in communities in Minnesota and California and Wisconsin, carrying a history that most Americans had never heard of, and that the government that had recruited them into its secret war declined to formally acknowledge for decades. The bombing of Laos, which was closely related to the secret war and to the effort to interdict supplies moving along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, resulted in Laos becoming the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on Laos, more than were dropped on Germany and Japan combined during the entirety of World War II. An estimated 30% of those bombs, perhaps 600,000 cluster munitions and conventional explosives, failed to detonate on impact. They remain in the soil of Laos. They have killed and maimed Laotian farmers and children in every year since the bombing ended. The United States government did not acknowledge the full scale of the bombing campaign publicly until 2016, when President Obama visited Laos and announced a $60–90 million commitment over 3 years to assist in clearing unexploded ordnance. The country has enough unexploded ordnance buried in its soil to maintain its current rate of casualties for another century. The contractors and the defense companies and the industrial suppliers who sustained the American war effort in Vietnam did not experience the war as a moral catastrophe. They experienced it as a business. The numbers are not obscure. Between 1965 and 1972, defense spending in the United States sustained an economy that had grown dependent on military procurement in ways that dated to the Korean War and to the permanent mobilization of the Cold War. Corporations with defense contracts lobbied for sustained commitment to the war effort. The revolving door between Pentagon procurement offices and defense industry executive suites moved in both directions and at speed. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a structural description of how the incentives were arranged, and the incentives were arranged to sustain the war, and the war was sustained, and the contractors were paid, and the soldiers continued to die. The anti-war veterans who organized and testified and threw their medals toward the Capitol building in 1971, the members of Vietnam Veterans Against the War who held the Winter Soldier hearings and described atrocities they had personally witnessed or committed, were treated by the Nixon administration as political enemies. The FBI monitored VVAW. The CIA conducted domestic intelligence operations against anti-war veterans in violation of its charter. John Kerry, then a young naval officer and VVAW spokesman, was placed on a watch list. The veterans who testified at Winter Soldier about killings of civilians and destruction of villages were largely dismissed in the mainstream press, their accounts described as unverified or politically motivated. Some of them were unverifiable. Some of them were documented. The distinction was less important to the people receiving the testimony than the political implications. And the political implications were unacceptable, and so the testimony was filed and forgotten, and the men who gave it went back to their lives. The peace movement and the soldiers fighting the war shared a country but not much else, which was one of the more quietly cruel features of the Vietnam era. The soldiers came disproportionately from working-class backgrounds, from communities without the social capital or legal resources to navigate the deferment system. College deferments, which kept the sons of the middle and upper middle class out of the draft, were one of the most significant and least discussed class dynamics of the war. The young men who were not in college and did not have fathers who knew lawyers and did not have family connections to National Guard units were the ones who ended up in the Mekong Delta. The young men who were in college and were exercising their legal right to avoid military service were the ones on the campuses protesting the war. Both groups were correct in their understanding that the war was wrong. They experienced their correctness from very different positions. The soldiers who came home to find themselves despised by a movement whose members had been spared the experience of the war were not wrong to feel betrayed. The Vietnamese perspective on the war exists largely outside the American narrative, which is perhaps the most fundamental distortion in the way the war is remembered in the United States. The war is an American story in the American telling of it. The Vietnamese who died in it, whose country was the site of it, whose society was fundamentally transformed by it, appear in this telling as context, as scenery, as the supporting cast of an American tragedy. The North Vietnamese soldier who fought for 20 years under American bombing and emerged victorious was a human being with a life and a family, and a reason for fighting that was coherent within his own experience. The South Vietnamese civilian who watched 3 successive governments claim to represent his interests and deliver mostly violence was a human being making impossible calculations in conditions of extreme danger. The history of the Vietnam War cannot be honestly told as an American story, and it has mostly been told as an American story, which means it has mostly been told incompletely. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March of 1973 under the terms of the Paris Peace Accords. The accords required the withdrawal of American forces and the return of American prisoners of war in exchange for a ceasefire and political negotiations between North and South Vietnam. The ceasefire did not hold. Fighting resumed within weeks of the agreement's signing. The political negotiations produced nothing. The United States continued to provide military equipment and financial support to the South Vietnamese government under Nguyen Van Thieu, who had been elected in 1971 in an election in which he was the only candidate. Congress, responding to public pressure and institutional exhaustion with the war, cut off most military funding for South Vietnam in 1974. The fall of Saigon followed in April of 1975, 18 months after American combat troops departed. The decade that followed the fall of Saigon produced a cultural reckoning with the war that was partial and selective, and in some ways more mystifying than clarifying. Hollywood processed Vietnam through a series of increasingly stylized narratives that were emotionally powerful and historically simplified. The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Born on the 4th of July. These were serious films made by serious filmmakers, and they captured genuine aspects of the war's psychological damage. They did not capture the systematic institutional failures, the corruption of metrics, the deliberate suppression of unfavorable intelligence, the structural incentives that made lying not just possible, but practically mandatory. They captured the experience of the individual soldier, and they left the decision-making apparatus largely intact and largely unexamined. The generals and the officials who ran the war remained off-screen. The Reagan administration's rehabilitation of the Vietnam War as a noble cause that was undermined at home rather than lost in the field had significant cultural and political consequences. The noble cause narrative shifted blame from the policymakers who designed an unwinnable strategy to the protesters who supposedly prevented the military from winning it. The historical record does not support this reading. The military itself, in the classified study that became the Pentagon Papers, concluded that the war had been pursued on the basis of flawed assumptions and continued after those assumptions had proven false. The Pentagon Papers were not a radical anti-war document. They were an internal government assessment that described in exhaustive detail the gap between official claims and private knowledge, the pattern of deception that ran from the Truman administration through Johnson and into Nixon. Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the documents to the New York Times and the Washington Post in 1971, was a former Defense Department analyst who had supported the war and changed his mind. The Nixon administration prosecuted him under the Espionage Act and, separately, organized a break-in at his psychiatrist's office to find material that could be used to discredit him. The break-in was conducted by the same group of operatives who would later break into the Watergate complex. The institutional memory of the Vietnam War within the American military produced a generation of officers who swore they would never again allow civilian leadership to deploy military force without clear objectives, sufficient resources, and a defined exit strategy. The Powell Doctrine, developed by Colin Powell in part from his Vietnam experience, codified these lessons in a set of criteria for military intervention that briefly became official policy in the 1980s and 1990s. The doctrine was applied in the Gulf War of 1991, which went as Powell had intended, and was then gradually abandoned as the post-Cold War strategic environment generated new kinds of interventions that did not fit its categories. The lessons of Vietnam did not prevent subsequent interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan that reproduced many of Vietnam's structural problems with variation in detail, but not in fundamental character. The families of the 58,220 Americans who died in Vietnam received their losses in different ways. Some found meaning in the sacrifice. Some found only loss. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, designed by Maya Lin and dedicated in 1982, was controversial at its unveiling because it did not look like a conventional war memorial. It was a list of names cut into black stone. It was not a monument to victory or to noble purpose. It was a record of the dead, which is what it needed to be, which is why veterans who initially opposed it came to regard it as the most accurate and honest thing the country produced in response to the war. You go to the wall and you see your reflection in the stone beside the name of the dead, which is not a comfortable experience and was not designed to be. The Vietnamese government completed the reunification of Vietnam in 1976. The country that emerged from the war was poor and isolated and carrying its own enormous weight of loss. Somewhere between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese had been killed in the war. Hundreds of thousands more died in re-education camps after the communist victory. The boat people, Vietnamese who fled the country in overcrowded vessels in the years following 1975, numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and many of them drowned in the South China Sea, and the world that had spent so much political and rhetorical energy on Vietnam's fate received these deaths with limited attention. The United States and Vietnam did not normalize diplomatic relations until 1995, 20 years after the fall of Saigon, which meant that for 2 decades, the country whose destruction the United States had funded and the country that had been destroyed were formally non-communicating, each processing the shared catastrophe in isolation. The war's end did not end its effects. The veterans continued to age with their damage. The Vietnamese continued to be born into a landscape contaminated by herbicides and unexploded ordnance. The children and grandchildren of American veterans were found, in some studies, to have elevated rates of certain cancers and birth defects, suggesting that Agent Orange exposure had produced heritable genetic damage. These findings were contested, and the research was incomplete, and the political will to pursue it was limited. The corporations that manufactured the herbicides agreed to settlements that did not require admissions of liability. The government that deployed the herbicides maintained its position that causal connections between specific individuals' health outcomes and specific chemical exposures could not be established with sufficient certainty to create legal liability. The people who were sick remained sick. The language that developed around the Vietnam War became its own kind of distortion. Collateral damage, free fire zones, neutralization, pacification, winning hearts and minds. The euphemisms accumulated into a vocabulary of evasion that allowed the war to be discussed in terms that obscured what was actually happening. Collateral damage means civilian deaths. Free fire zones mean areas where anything that moves can be killed. Neutralization means killing. Pacification means the suppression of a population through force. Winning hearts and minds means attempting to produce political loyalty through a combination of development assistance and military pressure in conditions where the military pressure consistently undermined the development assistance. The language was not created to deceive journalists or historians. It was created to allow the people making decisions to maintain psychological distance from the consequences of their decisions, which is a human mechanism and a dangerous one. The soldiers who came home and eventually began to talk, who organized veterans groups and wrote memoirs and gave testimony and in some cases spent decades before they could speak about what they had seen, were engaged in a form of witness that the institutions of American memory were poorly equipped to receive. The country wanted to move on. The country wanted the war to be a lesson learned without examining too closely what the lesson was, or whether it had actually been learned. The veterans who insisted on specificity, who said not that the war was a tragedy, but that specific people made specific decisions that produced specific outcomes that fell on specific human beings in specific places, were not comfortable witnesses. Specificity is hard to absorb. Abstraction is much easier to manage, and abstraction is what the official history largely provided. What can be said with confidence, drawing on the documents and the testimony and the research that has accumulated over 50 years, is this: the Vietnam War was conducted on the basis of systematically distorted information at every level of the command structure. The distortions were not primarily the result of individual dishonesty, though individual dishonesty was present. They were the result of institutional structures that rewarded optimistic reporting and punished skeptical assessment, that valued the appearance of progress over the reality of it, that could not acknowledge failure because the costs of the prior commitment made failure politically and psychologically unacceptable. The soldiers who fought the war were asked to risk their lives in support of a strategy that the people running the strategy privately doubted. They were sent into conditions of extreme moral complexity without adequate preparation. They were brought home to a country that did not know how to receive them. The Vietnamese, whose country was the battlefield, North and South, experienced the war at a scale and with a directness that no American, soldier or civilian, fully understood. The accounting for all of this was incomplete. Much of it never happened at all. In 1965, a young soldier arriving in Vietnam for the first time might have asked his sergeant what they were trying to accomplish, and the sergeant would have given him an answer that was coherent within the framework they had both been given. By 1969, the same question would have produced a different kind of silence. Not ignorance exactly. Something closer to the recognition that the question had been asked enough times without a satisfying answer, that asking it again was a kind of dangerous naivety. The war continued after that silence settled. It continued for 6 more years, after the recognition that the original rationale had failed. The men who had to fight it during those 6 years were fighting something that had already been privately conceded, and they knew it. And they went anyway, because the alternatives available to them were worse, and because the institutional momentum of a war, once established, does not require a justification to sustain itself. It requires only that the next rotation arrive on schedule, and that the paperwork continue to flow, and that the body counts continue to be compiled and transmitted upward through a chain of command that had long since stopped expecting the numbers to mean anything. The last American combat deaths in Vietnam occurred in 1975 during the evacuation of Saigon. The last American to die in the Vietnam War was Corporal Charles McMahon, Jr. and Lance Corporal Darwin Judge, Marines killed in a rocket attack at Tan Son Nhut Air Base on April 29, 1975, the day before the final evacuation. They were 21 and 19 years old, respectively. The war had been going on for longer than either of them had been alive.